Live from Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio, AM 740.
And welcome to the audio Imaginarium. This is indeed The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Congratulations, you have found us. And it is great to be with you, hanging out with you all, truly the highlight of my week. So come on in, grab a stool by the fire, and you are among friends. We are coming to you live from our flagship station, Zoomer Radio, in the Liberty Village neighborhood of Toronto, Canada, AM 740 and 96.7 FM. I've mentioned this before. I just find it so amazing, serendipitous, if you will, given the things that we talk about on the program, that we are broadcasting out of Toronto, but obviously, you know, what we talk about has to do with maintaining personal freedoms and liberties and so forth. And here we are broadcasting from the Liberty Village neighborhood of Toronto, and we're right here on Jefferson Avenue to boot. I know my American friends will appreciate that. Kris Millegan is a publisher of some very dangerous books, and he's also a longtime JFK assassination researcher. In fact, every year, Kris puts on an Oswald Conference, Lee Harvey Oswald, and he's standing by and will join us momentarily to talk about the JFK assassination. Specifically, I think we'll sort of drill down on Oswald's time spent in New Orleans in the months before the murder of President Kennedy, the summer of 1963. Looking forward to that. Ian Robertson is here, twisting the dials and knobs, our rockabilly friend. I'm thinking Ian might be, in fact, the reincarnation of Eddie Cochran. What do you think? He's nodding approvingly. Not many 20-somethings that even know Eddie Cochran, but you get James Dean as well. I can see that for sure. You're an old soul, to be sure. Albert Vinzel is here. Albert and I have posted our usual assortment of tantalizing tidbits in the slide carousel at strangeplanet.ca. That's the new website, strangeplanet.ca. It's really just a landing page, a platform, if you will, a deep space platform. Just go to the radio page once you're there. So again, strangeplanet.ca. And then there's a radio page, and click on The Conspiracy Show. And there you will find in the slide carousel at the top, a remarkable expose published by the London Daily Mail about a mob hitman who says he was the man on the grassy knoll who killed JFK, and he's actually serving time in an Illinois state prison. James Files is his name, and he insists he did it. He claims in the documentary, "I Killed JFK." He was the man who killed President Kennedy. He was moved from a high-security jail to a less secure one in Illinois, and he is preparing for his release next spring after 36 years behind bars. And James File says he was standing on the grassy knoll in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, and fired the fatal head wound that killed Kennedy. And he also claims Lee Harvey Oswald never fired a single shot, and that his boss, Charles Chucky Nicoletti, was in the book depository. Further, he claims the CIA turned against Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs invasion and plotted with the mafia to kill the president. I actually interviewed James Files' wife, maybe 8 years ago, I'm thinking it might have been, maybe a little less, a little longer. That'll be interesting when James Files gets released, if in fact he gets released. That's just one of the many stories you'll find up at the website strangeplanet.ca. And while you're there at strangeplanet.ca, you may want to register as a member, gain access to the member-only areas, which includes the audio archives, and you can go back and listen to past shows. I think you can go back as far as the summer of 2012. All right, to the main entree we go. We are fast approaching the 52nd anniversary of the assassination of the 35th President of the United States. And we are joined by a gentleman who, it's been a while since he's been with us. Kris Millegan is the organizer of an annual Oswald Conference. We'll find out more about that. And he is the publisher of, I think their list of books has gone over, it's up around 70 volumes now in print. Trinidad Books. And he's also the editor. This is, anyone who listens to this program and similar programs really needs to have this book on in their library, on their nightstand, Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. Investigations into America's most powerful secret society. Kris is also a musician. After first working in 1999 with author investigative reporter Daniel Hopsiger in producing Barry and the Boys, the CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History, Kris started Trinidad in 2000 as a vehicle to get suppressed books wider circulation. And as I mentioned, it has now grown to over 70 volumes in print and has succeeded in achieving a wider distribution for suppressed works. The current catalog can be viewed at Triniday.com, Trineday.com. He's also edited and, as I mentioned, author of Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, a prolific songwriter, and the annual conference that is produced by Kris Millegan and Trinidad Books. Lorian Fenton and Conscious Community Events, David Denton and the JFK Historical Group also participate in that. And also Judith Very Baker, who was a mistress of Lee Harvey Oswald, has been on this program. She's going to host the 3rd annual JFK Assassination Conference in Dallas, November 20, 21, 22, 2.5 days of presentations, and Kris will be a part of that. Kris Millegan, welcome to the Conspiracy Show. It's been a very long time since you've been with me. My fault entirely. How are you?
Well, thank you very kindly. I'm doing fine, sir. And thank you for having me on.
All right. First of all, because it's been a while since you've been on, those not familiar with you, hopefully they're familiar with the book, which you edited, Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. But let's just dial it back to a conversation you had with your late father in the 1960s. Your father was with the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA. He had a conversation with you one evening, or maybe it was over the course of several evenings, I'm not sure. But tell us what he dropped on you, kind of a bomb, I'm guessing.
Well, yes, and he had gone into the CIA also, and it was 1969, and he took me aside along with he had a professor from Vanderbilt with him, and he looked at me and he said, the Vietnam War is about drugs. There's these secret societies. And then he said, and communism's all a sham. These same secret societies are behind it all. It's all a big game. And at that time, I thought my dad was nuts. And a little light bulb came on my head, and I thought he was having the drug talk with me. It was late 60s. I was growing my hair long. And so I thought he was going to, tell me to stop smoking pot. So I straightened up and was getting ready for him to do that, but he just continued telling me all about his intelligence career from when he was an 18-year-old kid. And then they told me that he said that there was Vietnam. They were playing out a loose scenario in Vietnam. And then he started talking about propaganda and psychological warfare. And it became very apparent that I had no idea of what he was talking about.
It's interesting you're on the program with me tonight, Kris. A couple of weeks ago, I had E. Howard Hunt's son, St. John Hunt, on the program, and he sort of got a similar talk. This was his father's sort of deathbed confession, and he kind of set him straight. Have you had any communication with St. John Hunt?
Yes, and actually we met each other as musicians first, and we had talked, and I knew about him, and I says, "Now wait a minute, you're E. Howard Hunt's kid. Your book should be coming out from New York." And finally, when that didn't happen, I finally said okay to St. John, because I've printed one of his books, and then we just recently published another one of his about his mother's.
Oh, Dorothy, that you published that. Okay,
yes.
my apologies. I should have known that. Yes.
Well, and it's very interesting. We've had some talks about how, it's very strange growing up in a household of a spy, because they don't talk about their work at the dinner table. Matter of fact, they might even have to lie at the dinner table.
Right. Right.
So it's a very interesting upbringing.
Well, did your father ever talk to you about Kennedy?
Not really. Not really. He was a Kennedy supporter, and that was one reason. I mean, I had a hard time understanding because, he's just your dad. I knew he'd been involved with intelligence, not because he had talked to me, but because my older brother and older sister, we had talked about it because, we'd spent time overseas. I was born in D.C. and raised in Fairfax, and we had talked about it, but it hadn't been talked about. So it was just, I didn't know. Why should I believe him? He was just, I didn't think that he knew anything about all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then after he died, and when I got to go through his papers, I see that he did, and I am studying him more now, working on a book on him, and I come to find that he was working in psychological warfare in World War II. And that is the most significant part, because one thing that he started to do was he started to talk to me about these things that, telling me that they're playing out a loose scenario in a war. How do you get your head around something like that?
What does that mean, a loose scenario?
A lose. In other words, they're playing the war to lose.
Oh, to lose. Okay.
To lose.
Right.
And, I had a hard time as a kid, as it was, trying to, wait a minute, war, you kill people, and there's rules.
Right. All right. Listen, Kris, we're going to take a quick time out. When we come back, we'll talk about Kennedy, and we'll talk about the Oswald Conference coming up, and also Oswald's days in New Orleans, which is a very interesting chapter leading up to November of 63. Kris Millegan is the organizer of the Annual Oswald Conference, and he'll also be at a very important JFK conference in Dallas, November 20, 21, 22. And much more awaits right here on the very one and only Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Serrett. Please hang out with us.
Hearing PIN numbers, passcodes, social insurance numbers. If they make you wonder how private they are, here's two more numbers. 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
And welcome back. Great pleasure to have Kris Millegan with us, editor of Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, Investigations into America's Most Powerful Secret Society. His father was with the Office of Strategic Services in the Second World War. Bureau chief, was it South Asia, your father's posting, Kris?
His last covert job with the CIA was branch chief, head of East Asia Analysis Office, yes.
Well, interesting connection, obviously, with Southeast Asia and JFK, and yet he didn't talk to you about that. After he passed on and you went through his papers, did you find any interesting connections between your father's work and possibly the motive behind JFK's assassination?
Well, one of the things that I found out, and he had spoken to me a little bit about, was a meeting that he'd had in 1956 with a gentleman by the name of Ed Lansdale in Vietnam, which was one of the main impetuses for him leaving the CIA. And they were having a picnic, but they told the world they were having a battle. And when I looked at my how I found out a lot about it, I asked my mother how big Chiang Mai, Thailand was. And she had been with my father in 1956 in this trip where he'd been to Vietnam and Thailand. And she says, oh, the biggest thing in town was a church. She had a picture of it. And then my mother made an aside. She said, and that's when she stopped believing everything she read in the newspapers. And this kind of picked up my ears because my mother had been a very good CIA wife. I'd ask her questions, and she'd say, oh, she didn't know anything. And so I asked my mother, what did you mean? And she said, well, they'd been in Vietnam, and then they'd gone over to Thailand, to Bangkok, and then to Chiang Mai. And she said there had been a story in the newspapers about this big battle in Vietnam, right where they had been, but she said there had been no battle. They'd been having a picnic. And so I look at her picture book, and I look at Chiang Mai and the church, and I turn it back a few pages, and there's my dad sitting out talking to Colonel Lansdale. And then there's this beautiful picture of my mother. I ended up showing it to my other siblings, and it ended up being one of the main pictures in her memorial because she's just vivacious in it. And the caption to the picture off to the side, and you can see in this picture, you can see Lansdale, and he's sitting down and they're having a picnic, and there's these other people in camos and berets walking around. And it says Eudora, because that's my mother's name, it says Eudora out from Saigon with Colonel Lansdale and North Vietnamese military leaders.
North Vietnam. I mean, Lansdale was chief of CIA's Saigon military mission. He was there to prop up Diem, right?
Right, but a lot of that had all been manipulated. And this had been right after Lansdale had taken over the Golden Triangle from French intelligence. The French had left in 1954 after Dien Bien Phu, however you say that. Yeah, but they didn't leave the Golden Triangle. They stayed there, French intelligence, along with some Corsican mafia folks. And Lansdale had asked them to leave, and they said, well, no. And there's a book, actually by Gerald Posner, The Triad, that talks about this and says that this is one of the very few shooting wars between Western intelligence agencies. Basically, Lansdale went and got his own Corsican, Lucian Conan, and went up and took it over.
This is a turf war for the heroin.
Right. And you see, one of the things, the other thing that, big thing that my father told me, he said they're out to opiate your whole generation. And so you have a picnic, you tell the world you're having a battle. Well, why do you do that? And if you look at the historical record, Ed Lansdale did fake battles in the Philippines, and a gentleman, Fletcher Prouty, Colonel Fletcher Prouty, says that he did fake battles in Vietnam. But you
and that's the Mr. X character in Oliver Stone's JFK, Fletcher Prouty.
Right, and so he. You harden the sides, because then the people in the villages, they've got to, okay, who are you for? And so it hardens the sides, and pretty soon you have, American boys and girls going to hell for 1 year, and some Canadian boys and girls.
Yes.
And, they're going there for 1 year. After 1 year, they get to go home to their friends. Well, gosh, some of those boys and girls get addicted to the heroin that's being proffered to them by about anybody who's 12 years old and up. And it's, what does sadly, what does a junkie do? A junkie sells junk. And so it, quote unquote, contaminates the population in a widespread area starting in the early 60s. And it's part and parcel reversal of the psychological warfare that the Kennedy hit was.
Did your father ever talk to you, and I do want to move on to Oswald here in a moment, but did your father ever talk to you about the role of Air America in getting the heroin out of the Golden Triangle? And also, and this is one of the most distasteful aspects of the whole war, and there are many, but the idea or the theory, the rumor that heroin was being smuggled out of Vietnam in the caskets containing dead U.S. servicemen.
It's not a rumor, and it was actually stuffed into cadavers. And I did a lot of research, and it's just amazing. And when you look at the numbers, officially they say that there's a million to 1.2 million junkies in the United States. I personally think there's a few more. And if you just pencil that out as far as numbers, that's a ton a day. So it's a lot of activity goes around, and this is one of the activities that then also creates huge big slush funds that allows these forces from out of the shadows to affect our daily life and our children's future.
All right, Kris Millegan is with us, fleshing out Skull and Bones. Let's talk, because here we are, 52nd anniversary of the JFK assassination, and first of all, tell us about the Oswald Conference. Where and when?
Well, it happened in New Orleans in October, and we're going to have another one there last year. And actually, they started up there in Toronto. Because Judith Vary Baker, in her book Me and Lee, when it first came out, she'd already had so many accidents and so many death threats that she'd moved to Europe. When her book came out, she wouldn't come to the United States. And finally, when the soft cover of it came, I says, well, what about Toronto? Would you come to Toronto, the conspiracy culture there? And I says, Judy, when's it's going to come out? September, October? What is there a good date? And she says, well, Oswald's birthday is in October. And so we celebrated Oswald's birthday there at Conspiracy Culture, and brought her to speak. We had a great reception there. We got front page news. She got on a whole bunch of radio and television.
She was on the program.
None of it got over to the United States, and this heartened Judith. And because of that, we did her David Ferry book, because Judith, knew David Ferry, and it's just she is a first person witness. And so we've been starting to have celebrate Oswald's birthday, which, you're supposed to hate this gentleman, right? He killed our beloved president, but he didn't. He was a patsy. And this has helped turn around the thinking of Oswald and who he is. And Judith has been very much responsible with her first person witness. And then we're doing a Dallas conference because there are people that will not allow Judith to speak at, quote unquote, their conferences. And generally at their conferences, they don't like people to talk about LBJ's involvement. So we're looking to have, some honest discussion. And we've really, the conference in New Orleans was fantastic. We had Joan Mellon there, Jim Mars, Judith Vary Baker, Ed Haslam, Roger Stone, St. John Hunt, Ed Tatro, other people doing some just amazing research. And, if you look at the JFK, there's a lot of quote unquote contentious, and there's a lot of things that people don't agree on. And but there are two things that really we pretty much do agree on, at least the people that think that Oswald didn't do it, is that Oswald, didn't do it. He was an intelligence operative, and he was a patsy. And the other thing is that it was a coup d'etat. And those people are still in control today. And, we need, I'm terrible. I have an agenda. Some people think it's kind of trite, but I want my country back. Some people say, well, back to what? Back to freedom, back to something that actually stands on our Constitution, and a constitutional republic rather than this empire that has a need for slaves and not citizens.
We're coming up on a break here, but let's get the conversation rolling, and we'll continue after the break. And let's talk about Oswald in New Orleans. I mean, this ridiculous scenario of him handing out pamphlets for his Committee of One, Fair Play for Cuba. Didn't recruit a single individual to the cause, gets in fisticuffs with a number of anti-Castro Cuban exiles, gets paraded before the media, talking about his pro-Castro views. I mean, what was that really all about?
Well, it was about a couple of things. The main two things being creating his legend, giving him some pro-Castro bona fides, and then they would hand out these Fair Play for Cuba pamphlets, and there would be people there watching, and if the people actually kept them and didn't just throw them away, they would follow them, and if there were sometimes Latino people, they would then get them arrested and get them deported, because they were, searching for people that were sympathizers. So there was two different main uses for that action.
And the other interesting aspect, well, there are many, but one of them is the offices of his one-man Fair Play for Cuba committee, which now Guy Bannister, we should talk about Guy Bannister and his offices at 554 Camp Street in New Orleans, and the same building, but a separate entrance. Oswald is using the same building, to print up his pamphlets. And there's some discussion whether he and Bannister, ever met in the same building. The fact that they were both housed in the same building. We'll talk about that. The connection between Guy Bannister and Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in the months leading up to the JFK assassination. Kris Millegan is with us from Trinity Press, and the book again is Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. If you don't have it, get it. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show right here. My name is Richard Serrett. Stay with us.
Fasten your seatbelt and put your tray in the upright position. You're about to leave everything you know behind on The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio. Providing the evidence and letting you draw your own conclusions. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett on Zoomer Radio.
Kris Millegan is with us, Trinity Publishing, and the author, or the editor rather, of Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. His father was a member of the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, later with the CIA, served in South Asia. And a conversation back in the late 1960s with Kris and his father led Kris on this lifelong journey into investigating not only the JFK assassination, but, just, I guess, the way the world really works. And we were talking about Oswald in New Orleans, July 1963. We mentioned the connection with Guy Bannister, who, of course, Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, mentioned Bannister as being involved in the assassination of Kennedy. And it is interesting, Bannister, former FBI agent, was actually present at the killing of John Dillinger, caught the attention of J. Edgar Hoover, and I believe headed up the FBI in Butte, Montana, but was very a virulent anti-communist. And he was stationed at 531 Lafayette in New Orleans, and Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba was at 554 Camp, but those two streets met, and so it was the same building, different entrances, and there's some discussion as to whether Oswald and Bannister supposedly would be on opposite sides, obviously, but whether they were working together. And Bannister's secretary, it was a Delphine Roberts, I think her name was. She maintains that Oswald did meet with Bannister. What are your thoughts on Bannister and Oswald and a possible connection, Kris?
Well, Bannister, according to many sources, was still working within the FBI and within the intelligence services, especially on several secret projects. One within the right-wing militia community, another within a secret project that was in New Orleans that was weaponizing cancer to be used as a biological weapon to kill Castro. And Judith Baker gives testimony of going into Bannister's office. She actually, one time where she was there, she acquired some of his stationery. And Bannister is part and parcel of the milieu that you have involved in the Kennedy assassination and other types of secret projects. And what's very interesting in the Kennedy assassination, you have a lot of players that are double and triple and quadruple agents. And in intelligence operations, these double and triple and quadruple agents, sometimes they don't even know who they're working for and generally don't know exactly what they're doing because that's the nature of intelligence operations. But they're very valuable because they get things done. They move back and forth. They take information back and forth. And you have a situation such as the book that Dick Russell wrote, The Man Who Knew Too Much, of a gentleman by the name of Richard K. Snagel. And he knew something was going on. He didn't know exactly what, but he knew he didn't want to be involved. So he goes into a bank the week before the Kennedy assassination and shoots a hole in the ceiling so that when the Kennedy assassination happens, he's in jail. And when you have operations such as this, to find out who these double and triple and quadruple agents are and who they're talking to and how they're who they're talking through, they have things called shakedown cruises. And you had, most notably, you had one in Miami, and you had one in Chicago. The one in Chicago left a patsy in place, very similar to Lee Harvey Oswald. And we have testimony from Abraham Bolden that it was a gentleman by the name of Lee that gave him the information about that Chicago plot.
He helped thwart the plot against Kennedy. Kennedy was supposed to be taken out in Chicago, and it was supposedly Oswald who thwarted that plot. How do you square that with an Oswald who supposedly fires the fatal shots that kill the president? We will continue the conversation. Kris Millegan from Trinidad Publishing, the book Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, right here on The Conspiracy Show. No need to go anywhere else.
The owners of the system are asleep. Now we can play. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. Take a look around. What do you really see? This is where you can tell all about it. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
Just a quick heads up, top of the hour, we will open up the phone lines and we will do an hour of open lines. Doesn't happen very often on the program, but tonight is the night. Open lines beginning at the top of the hour. Welcome back to The Conspiracy Show. Richard Syrett with you. Kris Millegan on the line, and he, the editor of Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. Many of you will have this in your library, and if not, I urge you to get it. Kris, is going to be appearing at a very important JFK assassination conference in Dallas, November 20, 21, and 22. And many of the people appearing on stage and speaking have appeared on this show. Judith Very Baker, Ed Haslam, among them. You mentioned Ed. You mentioned the cancer virus, simian cancer virus 40, which supposedly was contained in the live polio vaccine developed by Dr. Salk. And once they found out that they were giving millions of people cancer, I guess Dr. Mary Sherman thought that she was brought on board to try and find the antidote. What was and this was taking place in New Orleans. So what was Oswald, his role in that? What was his relationship with Dr. Mary Sherman?
He seems to be a courier in that operation mostly. He would, he showed up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, possibly to pick up some radiological material. He went other places. He moved around town there in New Orleans. He showed up at Mary Sherman's apartment, and also to Juan Valdez's apartment, which was in the same apartment complex, where they would go into the restroom and just flush the toilet over and over and over again. And this appears to be getting rid of these cancerous tumors and some of the mice carcasses, because they had a secret lab through David Ferry, because they had to break up the different doctors in this secret program, so everybody didn't know what everybody was doing. They had a lab that was out at a house, and so it appears that Oswald was mostly acting as a courier, possibly as a little bit as security.
Okay, and we should just sort of set the stage here very quickly. So we have Judith Very Baker, who was doing remarkable things in high school with cancer and mice. We had Dr. Mary Sherman, who I guess sort of thought that she was brought on board to try and find an antidote for the simian cancer virus that was contained in the polio vaccine. But at the same time, I guess she learned that and perhaps Judy as well, that they were really weaponizing this virus and that it was going to be used against Castro. Is that right? Have I?
Yes, actually, there was this decision made to weaponize it to use against Castro, and both Mary and Judy were aware of that. And where Judy got herself in trouble was when she found out that they were using it on a prisoner, and they were not telling the prisoner that he was getting a cancer virus, and also that the prisoners were not already had a life-threatening cancer in them and were just healthy people. And when she complained that they were killing healthy people, she was then thrown off the program, and that pretty much saved her life, because her name changed from her maiden name to her married name, and she was away from New Orleans, because most everybody else involved in that experiment that we know of and is known of publicly is dead, and most of them murdered.
Well, and certainly Dr. Mary Sherman, one of them, met a grisly end. Was Oswald supposed to deliver this cancer virus to take out Castro? Is that why he went down to Mexico to try to get into Cuba?
That's what the testimony is of Judith Very Baker, which is the first-person testimony. And he wasn't going to take it to Cuba himself, but he was going to hand it off to somebody that was going to take it on to Cuba. And there has been quite a bit of, discussion whether he had gone to Mexico, and it's been pretty much shown that he did go. And yes, The Oswald Conference, there are videos of it, some excellent presentations from our researchers at oswaldconference.com. And then the upcoming conference is a very simple JFK conference.com. And people can check it out and see the speakers. We're also going to have Peter Dale Scott, and also going to have a very interesting presentation by Fernando Ferrara, who was a reporter on the ground when RFK was assassinated, because the day the conference starts, 11/20, is actually Robert Kennedy's birthday. And he did a lot of research about the girl with the polka dot dress.
Ah, yes.
Who officially still doesn't exist, but he begs to differ.
Yes, she's the one that presented Sirhan with the big carafe of coffee, and perhaps containing Rohypnol. We don't know what was in that coffee, but and that was all she wrote for poor Sirhan, who continues to languish in a prison.
And says that he was under mind control today. Sirhan says that today. Yes, it's a wild world, and again, it goes back to a psychological warfare, and goes back to what my father, these secret societies, how these secret societies control the world. There's a leviathan of 3 levels, and each level has 3 parts. Top level is mining, metal, and money, and they hold that real tight. Next is a very active thing, use the theater of war a lot. It's drugs, guns, and oil, which also includes allopathic medicine. And then they use all the funds from that to buy up all the other industries. And then where this Leviathan meets the road is media and movies / music, and they have to control that. And then quote unquote magic, the ability to hoodwink us, and their preponderance in using mass trauma to scare the heck out of us and put us into shock. And that's what the JFK assassination at its core was. It's the occult ritual of the killing of the king. And for my money, your crew is Hoover and LBJ, and they're low men on the totem pole. They're so blackmailable. You have them in your pocket. Then you have Alan Dulles, and he's a lawyer. And he's a lawyer for? Well, the Bush family. There was George H.W. Bush and Nelson Rockefeller. You had Hoover writing a letter the day after the assassination that mentions George Bush of the CIA, and he's covering his fanny there, and because the shock that the country went into, and we've never been the same country since. The percentage of the population that believes in its government, believes in what America is about, drastically changed.
I mean, you have, and Judith Very Baker have a huge task in trying to sort of rehabilitate, I guess, the image of Lee Harvey Oswald. Although, the polls suggest that if he was involved, he certainly didn't act alone, and the Joint Committee on Assassinations in was that 1978 suggested also there was also a conspiracy. Here, we just have a few minutes remaining, but let me throw this out at you. And this speaks, I guess, to Judith Very Baker's relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald. And the question is, because it has been speculated widely, that the Oswald that came back from Russia was not the Oswald, that went to Russia and so forth, that there were doubles, that there were maybe numerous Lee Harvey Oswalds. Is it possible that Judith Very Baker met one Oswald, but it wasn't the Oswald? What do you think of that? What do you think of the whole Oswald double theory?
I don't know. I do know that there was something within the CIA called the Oswald Project, and they were talking to that about when he was in Russia. a lot of what is presented as evidence can be shown to be playing with photographs. And I'm sure that there were imposters that were used to play Oswald at times. But whether there's these two big, long narratives of a Lee Harvey and a Harvey Lee, that a lot has been shown to me to be spacious.
All right.
So I don't really believe that. It's shown to me by quite a few different people coming from different angles. But I do believe that Oswald was used as an intelligence legend, and he was a patsy.
Now,
and I do believe that that was a true Lee Harvey Oswald that was born in New Orleans at Judith Ferry Baker.
All right. Now, Judy's insistent that Oswald was a fan of Kennedy, which is kind of interesting because, obviously much of the intelligence apparatus in the United States at the time, people in the OSS, E. Howard Hunt certainly had no love for Kennedy. He wasn't alone in that. Let's face it, people were lining up to take a shot at the president. This sacrificial lamb sort of wandered into this national security state, and so I just find it interesting. Oswald was anti-Castro, and yet we had Kennedy. Some said he was trying to appease Castro. Why would Oswald have been a fan of John F. Kennedy?
Well, the Warren Commission, the anti-Castro was just part of a legend, and the Warren Commission even showed that that Oswald was a fan of Kennedy. They couldn't use that as a motive that he hated Kennedy. And again, when you're an intelligence operative, you say and do many things to create your legend. And the story that Judy and the story that Ed Haslam tells and other people talk about is that now when Oswald came back from the Russia, when he had to get his paper signed to say, okay, you can come back, that had to go on up, and one of the offices that would have had to sign that would have been the office of the Attorney General. And there's quite a bit of information to show that as an intelligence operative, one of the operations that Oswald was doing was working out of the Attorney General's office because they were trying to shut down the anti-Castro sites, and little time after Oswald visited one in Louisiana, it was shut down.
All right, Kris, unfortunately, we are out of time. So much more to discuss. We'll have to leave it here for now. Thank you so much for being with us. Give us a website.
TrineDay.com, JFKConference.com. And thank you so much.
My pleasure. TrineDay.com. All right, the website here, strangeplanet.ca. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Serrett. As always, follow the truth.